Jeff O'Driscoll. Jeff O'Driscoll is a civil engineer with over 30 years of experience in engineering management, project development, and planning, design and construction, and is currently the infrastructure division manager for Associated Engineers Winnipeg office. So with that, we're going to pass it over to Jeff.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Hopefully, maybe you can get some acknowledgement that you can see me and hear me. So I'm going to, first of all, talk to you about the high-level screening guide. I'll just give you a bit of an overview. And like I said, my name is Jeff O'Driscoll with Associated Engineering. I come to you from Winnipeg. And I acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory and homeland of the Ojibwe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Dene peoples, and the Métis Nation of Manitoba. So thank you so much. Next slide. So really what I want to talk to you about in the next 10 minutes or so is the high-level screening guide. And the high-level screening guide was developed to provide a more streamlined and rapid screening level approach to climate risk assessment. It's building upon the PIEVC products in general, but many of you, as saw by the poll, are not necessarily aware of the application. So really, I'm going to try to give you an overview, a few minutes to see that. And of course, you can go to the pievc.ca site, grab a copy, register, and all the products are there as well. So next slide. And I think, so when we develop these products, they're not done by just myself or others. There's a large group of people, including some of the people presenting, Joel and Joan, and a number of people on here, as well as the sponsors of these programs. So, but just to let you know, and that it was developed by a team of experienced practitioners and stakeholders. So the high-level screening guide is really an evolution of PIEVC product. And it's a very important thing. So much of what's gone into it is the experience of doing PIEVC assessments over the last, say, almost 15 years, and trying to streamline the process, provide the tips and a variety of things to make that happen. So next slide. So for those of you not necessarily overly aware of PIEVC, PIEVC is a climate risk assessment tool. It was developed by Engineers Canada originally many years ago, and now taken over by the PIEVC partnership. And it really was just a basic risk assessment based process where you looked at what were you defining, get information, do risk assessment, do engineering analysis, and move forward. As we started to use that product, what we'll call kind of the conventional or PIEVC classic or more comprehensive PIEVC, many of us practitioners started to streamline the process anyway. So a few years back, we decided, or through the partnership, they decided to maybe refresh that into a little bit more of a streamlined process, one that had more application to many users, and a little bit more streamlined instead of a very large guidance manual. So we broke it down into a very similar product, but we just sort of rebranded it in terms of understanding the scope, getting data, assessing your risk, and reporting, and then moving into some type of adaptation step. And to do that, we kind of have this roadmap in terms of things. And I'll walk you through this process of what the high-level screening guide suggests in a few things. Next slide. And I think part of understanding why it's a guide, it's not a standard, is that you can apply this to many different attributes and many aspects, depending on what frame you're coming from. So in the Canadian context, the federal government and many of the provinces and many municipalities are dealing with what they call a climate lens. So, with projects requiring funding and a requirement, a resilient assessment is required as part of that process. And the high-level screening guide is a great tool to do that. We really looked at that process and really built the tool to work with that almost, completely, but also the other aspects. It's a really good tool to support the First Nations Infrastructure Resilience Toolkit, which is in evolution as well. And asset management, a lot of municipalities are really either refreshing, doing a more asset management plan or creating plans. And a good climate risk assessment process as a layer in that asset management plan is very key. And the high-level screening guide is great for that. As a designer, using it in a preliminary design process for climate consideration is a really important tool, as well as we move into more and more necessity to work at natural infrastructure. This is a great way to look at it. And we've expanded it from a very infrastructure-centric view, as well as, just applications in general, maybe on the international scene, where this can be used in the spirit of ISO 31000 and 14090. Next slide. So I'm just going to walk you through some of the steps, as well as some of the pieces. So really, step one is really where you're looking at understanding the objective of your assessment, the scope. In this case, for the graphic, it's like for a climate lens application. So kind of what products, what inputs, what timeframes are there. But within also the context is the work plan. If you see in this graphic on the left, the step one where we have scope, criteria, context, and criteria, that aligns well with the ISO processes and language. It also, what we've bundled in terms of things is an idea of what type of team would be required to do these kind of things and where that emphasis is. So next slide. So some of the things that the product does is not only has the process, but will help you to decide on what kind of team you need to put together to do an assessment, what sort of technical needs, administration needs, stakeholder input in terms of that. So there's guidance in terms of how to build your assessment team. Smaller assessments might require smaller teams. Larger assessments might require larger teams and more specialty. Depending on the rigor you might want to have professional engineers assigned. It depends on your application. Next slide. It also gives you some idea of how to scope this assessment in a simple context. Now this, we gave some overall direction of scope, general timeframes, and team. So, maybe a municipality or somebody might want to develop a work plan or an RFP based on this to understand how this will fit into their process in terms of how many timeframes or things. Now, this is for a very simple assessment. More complicated assessments probably require larger timeframes, more rigor in terms of project management. Next slide. When we get into the next step, and this is where we start to, we've already defined the project scope, probably some of the geography, some of the timelines. We're starting to get into the understanding of the actual elements. And we used to call it infrastructure, but we call it elements because really what we're looking at is as a wider view. So this is where we define what we're looking at in terms of either infrastructure, natural environment, people. We define the boundaries. And in many cases, this is where we go and see the infrastructure, some site visits. We also in the box, probably we bold out or highlight probably who will lead this phase of the assessment. And this is probably more the technical side. Next slide. There's also, some guidance as you develop your elements or your asset lists, just some ideas that there are, are you looking at single asset portfolio or larger portfolios of work? And the high-level screening guide can definitely look at both applications and more simple applications of portfolios. Those are relative larger groups, maybe similar infrastructure or categories as well. When you get into very large, complex portfolios, you probably start to need to look at other products to enhance that, but the high-level screening guide is embedded into those processes as well. Next slide. And like I said, when we look at asset categories as part of these elements, we really look at the traditional way PIEVC uses a lot of the bricks and mortar types of things, roads and bridges and culverts and buildings. But we also more and more, we're really needed to adapt to climate changes, to look at the natural environment, as well as the interaction of people, employees, stakeholders, users of these facilities in a larger sense. Next slide. And there's more and more guidance in terms of actual attributes, elements, sub-elements, and stuff in the tool for you as well. Next slide. So once we've kind of have the idea of elements, at the same time, and not as a next step, is starting to look at climate and really to feature, your climate. What are you looking at, given that this is a climate risk assessment process, developing those parameters, hazard, and indicators. And this is where you're going to establish what kind of climate scenario you're looking at into the future. More climate change effects or less climate change effects. How far into the future are you looking? How do you establish overall thresholds? And ultimately, the end of the process is to establish likelihood scores for those climate elements. Next. And we provide a host of resources to get that information, and that's current. If you're not in the Canadian context, you can definitely move forward into some other pieces and otherwise. Next slide. One of the innovations in the high-level screening guide is at least one simplified approach to assign likelihood scores to a lot of the climate information. Over many years and working with many climate scientists, we came up with some general tendencies of ourselves of a framework. How do we turn that climate projection and data into scoring that we can use in the next phase of risk assessment? So we came up with this approach, or a simplified approach, where we can, in some cases for a method, really be founded around the idea of the current climate being in the middle, and there's going to be more or less climate change in the future, or more of that event or less of that event. It's a very qualitative approach, but also there's also other rationale to establish that have more quantifiable or other means. So the simplified method is there, and we'll call that the baseline approach, and it can kind of work very easily. So I would suggest something, a lot of our current climate might be in the middle. Now, working on this for a few examples, things like extreme rainfall might actually start higher because some of the shifts from the existing data have already moved forward. So that's just a general idea. Next slide. And within that, we love to the tool helps you to document all of this information and to create reports, and we give some sample reports. Next slide. Once we have all that together, the heart of the PIEVC process is really how do we interact between those elements and those climate parameters to come up with consequence and likelihood to come up with a risk score. And based on that risk score, we can move forward into understanding. So really that's the key. In a lot of cases in PIEVC, next slide, it's done through the use of a worksheet where we put together all of the information developed in the previous steps. And this is where we kind of interact, we go through, we establish overall the consequence. The risk assessment piece is really the risk identification is very much through a discussion on consequence. If this happens, how bad is it? The climate data and climate projections provide you the likelihood, and that's where you come together. So next slide. So once you bring all that together, usually done in a workshop or can be done in a workshop form for large or done in groups or done individually and circulated, move that. Then we get into this idea of summarizing the risk into high, medium, and low risks. And then based on those high, medium, low risks, we start to look at actions. So obviously, that's very important. Other frameworks may have different scales in terms of high, medium, high, and other risks. And you're welcome to move that on in terms of some of your risk thresholds as well. Next slide. And then finally, at least in the process, is the reporting. This is where you do the final risk analysis, document the work that you're doing, and then move into other stuff related to reporting. Next slide. And this is really about finalizing the steps of the study. So in a climate lens assessment, this is where you would look at actions and adaptive actions related to medium and higher risk items as well. A few things. This is kind of, step 3, the first steps are identifying the risks. And this is step 4 is about the risk treatment and next steps. Next slide. And then just overall reporting, and this can be verbal reporting. It can move into next phases of work. It can be done internally, next things. And one final slide after this, Dan. So, and then really moving on to next steps of adaptation. So really within the confines of your process, it isn't necessarily an adaptation plan, but it's a step before adaptation planning. So there's a variety of frameworks to move that forward. So that's kind of a little high level overview of the tool. And you'll gain more of this as you see some of the next presenters sort of talk about the application. So thanks, Dan.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and sorry for the limited time allotment. There's a lot to cover here, yeah. But excellent overview. We do have a couple of questions about methods here, but I think these can be saved for the general panel discussion. I think many of our panelists will have some thoughts on these. So we'll leave it there, and thanks again, Jeff, for your input.